Residential Schools with Words and Images of Survivors, Larry Lowy, with Wayne K. Spear and Constance Brizenden. A National History. Residential Schools. For over a century, Canada removed more than 150,000 Aboriginal children from their families to attend church-run residential schools, often in remote locations far from home. This hidden history is told by award-winning author and former student Larry Lowy. In residential schools, with the words and images of survivors, why did Indian residential schools, as they were called, happen? How did they continue? Why did they stop? Most significantly, how did they affect their families and the children now known as school survivors? The goal was assimilation, the elimination of First Nations Métis and Inuit cultures, traditions, and languages. While the result was painful and destructive, the survivors are finally being heard, their experience shared, and their healing revealed in words and personal images. Included in residential schools, with the words and images of survivors, are memories of more than 70 former students and family members. 7 comprehensive chapters address key issues from why did it happen and the meeting of culture and traditions to coping with a new life and healing in a changing world. More than 125 images, many of the personal collections of survivors, enhance the impressive design. A map of Canada's residential schools, a key dates, poster, glossary of terms, and index are included. Residential Schools with the Words and Images of Survivors is proudly co-published by Indigenous Education Press of Brantford, Ontario, and Chinook Residential School Centre at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie. There we go. So this is honoring all children who attended residential schools, especially the youngest, and the students of today who want to know about the students of yesterday. Girls brush their teeth and spit into a bucket at St. Philip's Indian Residential School. The Anglican school was in Fort George on James Bay in northern Quebec. It opened in February 1933 and closed in 1979. Graduating class at Coqualitza Residential School in British Columbia in 1932. The Latin motto, Vestigia nulla restorasum, means no stepping back. But students, like class president and valedictorian William Bill Walkham, Nalka Palmu, did step back in their cultures. Vestigia nulla restorasum. Introduction. Larry Lowy Cree, a survivor story. Residential Schools with Words and Images of Survivors is a national history of residential school system. Why did these schools happen and how did they continue? When did they stop? It is more than this. Survivors, former students of residential schools, have begun to share their stories, revealing the past has been painful for many, myself included, yet we know we need to do it. The hidden history of residential schools must be known to ensure the future human rights of all Canadian children. Residential schools no longer exist, but we must not forget them. In my early childhood, I lived in traditional Cree life in the forests of northern Alberta, Canada. My grandfather, Edward Twin, taught me how to live in a good way. I shared his closeness with nature and loved all that was learning about our culture. I was called Oskiniko, young man, in English because I had already learned many skills needed to survive and live an independent life. I was going to public school in Slave Lake, Alberta, and learning to read and write. At the age of 9, I lost this beautiful way of life when I was forced to attend residential school. I was one of more than 150,000 children who experienced these schools across Canada. All an estimated 144 schools operated at different times from the late 1800s to 1996. For 6 years in the 1940s, I attended St. Bernard Mission Residential School in Grouard, one of 25 schools in Alberta. 7 of us went from the family. I wasn't allowed to... Before we turn the page? Yes, Lama. Before we turn the page, can you read that? I will. So this is author Larry Loyal. Okay, and burns sweetgrass in the cemetery of Grouard, Alberta site of his former residential school to honor the children buried there. That sounds really horrible. This is a really sad history, but it's important we know it. What's this say over here? Children in Larry's school were not allowed to speak their language. Larry learned to serve the Mass in Latin and sing in Latin. Excuse me. Good. Larry serves as an altar boy at a priest's funeral in 1948. There's Larry right there. Speak Cree or talk to my 4 sisters. The staff and teachers of the Catholic school could punish us whenever they wanted, which they often did. To support the school, we children did many chores that took us away from the classroom. It was a lonely and frightening life. I went home for 2 months every summer, but the others stayed at the school year-round. At age 13, I felt joy to be released from the prison-like school. I had wanted to get a good education. This didn't happen. As most of the teachers were not trained, I did have one educated teacher, Sister Teresa, who inspired me to continue learning. I am grateful to her. And although the residential school system destroyed many families and too many lives, it did not destroy cultures. Today, school programs and curricula teach positive aspects of the Aboriginals' ways of life. I can now talk openly about residential school. The truth is out, and I feel hopeful about the future. At last, we are remembering and honoring these children. Can you go back a page? I'm going to go back a page before you go on. So, after their chores were done, children were allowed to skate outdoors. Larry loved this pastime and the feeling of freedom it gave him. He dreamed of being a hockey player and practiced hard. The girls watched him skate from their dormitory, loved beside the rink. That's kind of cute. And these residential schools were often located in isolated areas. St. Bernard Mission was 130 kilometers from the Loy home. That's fucking scary. Yeah, that's why these kids would, they'd die trying to run away. From left to right, schoolhouse, boys' dormitory, and church. What was that? That was a kid down the hall. What's this? What's this? Children were taken to St. Bernard Mission on a truck like this one. The trip took all day on a dusty road with no food or water to drink. That seems kind of messed up, buddy. It is, Donna, it is. Matter of human rights. Yeah, read this part. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 1, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On December 10th, 1948, Canada signed a United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Among other articles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights confirms that every human being has the right to a free education, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Education must be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Education must promote understanding and tolerance and friendship among all nations and racial religious groups. That is such a great idea, and yet that so seldom happens. I know. But let's keep going. Finally, the Declaration said that parents must have a prior right to choose the kind of education given to their children. That's so cool, and yet it so seldom happens. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know about this. And even if they did, it would be very hard to enforce it. So it's a beautiful theory, but, practice is very different. Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its stand on education forced the Canadian government to look at its treatment of Aboriginal people and their children in residential schools. Another 21 years passed before the schools officially began to close. They really take their sweet ass time, don't they? Yep. And there's still problems, but what can you say? At least someone said something. Who's that? I'm gonna find out. On our way of life sustained us for more than 10,000 years. When Europeans arrived, they looked on us as savages because our beliefs were not theirs. They did not respect our cultures and traditions, yet they needed us to survive in North America. We led European explorers across an unknown land, and we made fur traders rich with our hunting and trapping skills. We fed newcomers who would have starved without us. All of this was pushed aside when the government wanted our land or settlers. That's Larry Loy Cree. And who's that? Left is Leon Prince. So that's Leon Prince there. Stands in his skiff displaying his fine catch of sturgeon in British Columbia. That looks freaking awesome. It looks tasty. And this is his granddaughter. Violet Rossetti Okunma shared this photo above. Traditional teacher Margaret Cardinal Plains Cree prepares a moose hide in northern Alberta. Moccasins are made of moose hide, were the preferred footwear of the fur trade. So why did this stuff happen? Well, we're going to get to that. Why did it happen? So let's go back to this picture right here. The residential school system before the arrival of European explorers, as many as 2 million Aboriginal people lived in what is now Canada. They survived off the land, practiced their traditions and spiritual beliefs, designed dwellings, invented tools, created art, built communities, and developed trade routes and communication systems across North America. The extended family was crucial to survival. Older members looked out for younger members, teaching them the skills they needed to live with nature. The first permanent European settlement in Canada was launched by the determined explorer Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, he arrived from France and built a fort in today's Quebec City. The settlement took hold and grew. Soon, priests and nuns arrived to introduce the Roman Catholic faith. They opened small schools to teach children to speak French, read, write, and work as translators. For several centuries, Aboriginal people were valuable allies. With them, the Hudson's Bay Company and other traders profited from the sale of billions of animal pelts. European traders relied on their hunting and trapping skills and inventions such as the canoe, snowshoe, and toboggan. Beaver hats adorned the heads of millions of Europeans from the 1670 to the 1800s. Fort Edmonton is a Hudson's Bay Company fort reproduced today in Edmonton, Alberta. Thousands of voyagers passed through the fort, canoe bridges, delivering trade goods and returning with animal pelts to be shipped to England. The many styles of beaver hats. Those are all made of beaver? Those are all made of beaver pelts. Those are fucking badass. They had some pretty badass styles back then. Johnny McDonald, friend or foe? Bo! Come on, you. By the late 1800s, beaver hats went out of style and the fur trade faded. Overhunting had depleted the stock of fur-bearing animals, some to the verge of extinction. Millions of bison, the most important animal in the prairies, were slaughtered to make way for the settlers. Aboriginal people found themselves less able to live off the land. Illness, epidemics, and deprivation caused thousands to die. Under Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, their plight did not improve. His dream of a nation stretching from sea to sea had one major obstacle. As Macdonald saw it, Aboriginal people were in the way. What the fuck? Well, that's how they thought back then. Move, bitch, get out the way. Are you freaking serious? That's how they thought. They didn't want to share. There were even less people then. They just didn't want to share, buddy. To free up the land, the reserve system had to be established. In return for treaty rights such as health care and education, Indians, as they were commonly called, were moved to designated areas known as reserves. Here, they found themselves under strict government control. Why would they call them Indians anyways? Because Columbus was looking for a passage to India, so when he came to, I don't think it was Jamaica, he came to the West Indies and he found Arawaks. And then didn't he kill them all off within a matter of decades? He was responsible for the genocide of the Arawaks. Oh, nice. But they called them Indians because he thought he was in India. Was he a retard? I think he was drunk. But he was commissioned by the Queen, so, They can't admit to wrongdoing. No. It's a royal thing. You sure all royals are like that? Well, they're not like that anymore, but a lot of people had to speak out for centuries. In the United States, the last Indian War took place in 1898-91. You sound like Timmy from South Park. Shh, Lamish. In next door Canada, Louis Riel and his Métis allies fought for their rights in Manitoba. To attract settlers to the undeveloped West, Prime Minister Macdonald knew he had to reassure them that Canada was a safe haven. As European settlement progressed across the West, valuable natural resources such as timber and gold were discovered. To confiscate these resources, Indians were moved onto even smaller reserves, yet this wasn't enough for the Canadian government. So I did this. This was a blanket ceremony we did at Parliament, where they move you onto a blanket to show you what it's like, and then they move you to smaller blankets and smaller blankets and smaller blankets, and they take away pieces. To tell you what it was like to be moved on a reserve? I don't think it really tells you what it's like to live on a reserve, because I've been on the reserve, and it wasn't like the blanket ceremony at Parliament, but I think it illustrated an idea, which was interesting. Assimilation, the act of becoming part of something to assimilate the process, is which one group takes the cultural other traits of a larger group. So, who was on the blanket? Me and all the girls from the shelter. So you guys were fucking homeless, and you're doing the blanket thing to find out what it's like to be a native? It's hard to explain, but yeah, I guess so. Well, what about Parliament? Why couldn't they give you housing? Away from their families, the forced assimilation of Aboriginal children began on day one in residential school. The policy was called aggressive civilization. No shit. So to be so civilized, you must tell civil lies? Very funny. In an 1879 report by journalist Nicholas Flood Davin to the Canadian government, staff at the schools used verbal, physical, emotional, and psychological punishments to carry out the forced assimilation. The policy failed, but the tragic effects are still felt today. So it was basically like the Borg. It was very much like the Borg. It was assimilate or die. But for children! Yep. And not with the cool headgear. Well, not yet, because science hadn't invented that stuff yet. For defending Métis rights, Louis Riel, top right, was convicted for treason and hanged on November 16, 1885. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald Wright, refused to commute to Louis Riel's death sentence. Louis Riel's tombstone above, St. Boniface Cathedral, St. Boniface, Manitoba. Wait, why did Louis Riel get it? For defending Métis rights. Holy shit, so if you stepped in, they were gonna hang you. Yeah, they'll execute you. They do that a lot. It's called divide and conquer. Is that why you like Pink Floyd so much? I think Pink Floyd is a good, I know a lot of people who came out of the school system loved Pink Floyd, Another Brick in the Wall, and Together We Stand, Divided We Fall. Let's talk about this, though. Let's go back here. The Mush Hole. Students at the Mohawk Institute had their own special name for the school. They called it the Mush Hole. The name was inspired by the sticky porridge the children ate every morning. The secret nickname gave them a feeling of power, however small it may be, over their circumstances. A strict role model. The British North America Act of 1867, Section 7124, followed by the Indian Act of 1876, gave Prime Minister John A. Macdonald and the Canadian government complete control over the country's Aboriginal people. The government began to seriously consider establishing Indian boarding schools. Living at these schools away from their family Their families and the children could be completely controlled by staff through a process known as assimilation. The children's beliefs and behaviors would be forcibly adjusted to the European way of life. The model for these schools was the Mohawk Industrial School, also known as the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. So there's like nothing Mohawk about that. Well, no, that was a Mohawk assimilation school. Do you think they were allowed to wear Mohawks? No, they just shaved their heads, like in the Nazi death camps. Are you freaking serious? They shaved the boys' heads and they cut the girls' hair into like bobs. The Mohawk Institute still stands in Brantford, Ontario. Student groups visit the building and its library today and learn about residential school history. It looks horrible. Like 7th layer of hell. Yeah, imagine having to live there. The Anglican-based school was financed by the New England Company, a Protestant missionary society based in New England, USA. It opened in 1828. As the Mechanics' Institute, 3 years later, it began to take in boarders from Six Nations Reserve. A former British Army officer was in charge. The harsh daily routine, rules, and regulations were based on a strict Army training. Although it opened long before the first official residential schools in 1892, the Mohawk Institute inspired the system that followed. Are you freaking kidding me? So they were like in military school. To a degree. It was kind of like a torture chamber, military school. There's been a lot of survivor guilt. There is. Survivor speaks. They tried to convert me in there. They took away my ceremonies, my rituals, my language. They tried to assimilate us. They told us our religion and rituals were the devil's work. My father put me in there in 1942. He assumed it was a good place because I was going to get an education, but they took away my language, my own spiritual beliefs, and my culture. Not for a minute would he have sent me there if he had known. Geronimo Henry Mohawk attended Mohawk Institute from 1942 to 1953. Jesus Christ, it makes you just want to like hail Satan. It does. I mean, is that what satanic is? To a lot of people, that is what satanic is. Don't teach them too much. Like, why? So these boys posed in 1926 at Brandon Industrial School for Lenore Kirk, a nurse at the school. This page in her photo album has been the title Future Hog Raisers. The album was donated to the United Church Archives. The Methodist School, later United Church, opened in Brandon, Manitoba, 1895. Holy shit. Don't teach them too much. Why is that? Because they don't want them to learn too much. It's kind of like a mental form of hobbling. So, like the starvation and the mental abuse and the physical abuse, that's all about hobbling? It's about hobbling your soul. Indian boarding schools were recommended in a government report to the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada in 1845. 2 years later, the Department of Indian Affairs wrote to Dr. Egerton Ryerson, the Methodist head of the education in Upper Canada, asking for ideas for Indian schools. Ryerson had visited a reform school for juvenile delinquents on a trip to England in 1836. He approved the brutal system and recommended a similar system for Indian education. Dr. Ryerson advised that the education of Indians consist not merely of the training of the mind, but of the weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, arts, and customs of civilized life. He cautioned the schools not to teach the children too much for fear they would take jobs away from white people. Are you freaking serious? Yeah. I did that. Industrial model. Both American and Canadian governments were looking for solutions to the Indian problem. Why were they a problem? Because they didn't want to share a lot, huh? I told you that. They didn't want to share resources. That's what racism is about. And we'll talk about Northern Ireland one day, too. So they just make shit up like people are inferior. Yeah. They're not really inferior. No, I don't think they're fucking inferior, but they just tell them that they're inferior because they don't want to share, basically. That's fucked up. That's not cool. No, it's not. Unfortunately, that's, our history. So, industrial model. Both American and Canadian governments were looking for solutions to the Indian problem in the United States. It was estimated to cost an average of $1 million to kill an Indian in battle, but it only cost $12,100 rather, to give an Indian child 8 years of education. Can you imagine that? So it cost $1 million to kill them, but $1,200 to give an Indian child 8 years of education in jail. Basically, jail was cheaper. The United States looked to the Mohawk Institute as a model for its own industrial schools. So when they say industrial schools, do you ever think of Trent Reznor and had like a hole? Absolutely, 100%. And he's wearing a mohawk. Do you think he's like Mohawk? I don't know if I care. But isn't that like cultural appropriation? Well, back then a lot of these guys were around, but they weren't blood quantum. They couldn't say they were native because they're probably not blood quantum, but they were probably had some cultural roots they weren't allowed to talk about, because it was just a very strict what you could or could not say. Even today, people police what people say, so they just automatically do it. They can't even help it. Let's keep reading. Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the first U.S. school, was opened in 1879 by a U.S. cavalry officer, Captain Richard Henry Pratt. Some of his first students were former Indian prisoners. Carlisle's goal became Canada's goal to eliminate Aboriginal languages, traditions, and cultures through a process of forced assimilation. Boys would be trained to work as farmers and laborers. Girls would learn to sew, cook, and clean, to run a household, or work as a maid. And this is girls sewing at Lebret Indian Residential School in Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan, in 1874. The publicity photo looks frozen in time. All traces of the girls' Aboriginal background have been removed. The Catholic school opened in 1884 and burned down in 1908. I wonder who burned it down. Someone who didn't want to get fucking surgery. Do you think they gave them brain surgery? No, they used starvation and beatings and sexual abuse. Sleep deprivation, exposure to diseases, that kind of stuff. I'm glad they burned it down. Yeah, but, they shouldn't have had to. So these are beginners in 1909 at All Saints Indian Residential School at Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan, with a teacher. The girl's hair is cut in the bowl style. That is the grossest freaking haircut ever. Why would they do that? Well, to defeminize them. Hair is power. And they didn't want them having a personal style, right? So they had to turn them into cookie cutter because that's part of the military system. The girl's hair was cut in the bowl style, common in residential schools. That is the grossest fucking haircut. I thought they were going to get bobs. Why did you say they were going to get bobs? Well, I thought they had bobs. I've seen it in other books where they had bobs. And most girls had bobs back then anyways, because, this is the turn of the century and they cut their hairs right off. Did they stick a bowl on their head? I don't know. They look like boys. Well, at that age, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. If you cut their hair and you dress them up the same, it's really hard to tell the difference. There's something creepy about that. Yeah. No doubt. Yeah. I agree with you, Llama. I'm not arguing. The four churches. In 1879, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, boo, asked journalist Nicholas Flood Davin to visit the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania and report back. Davin was impressed with the school's tough military-style policies. I bet he was. I can imagine back in the day they would be impressive. Watching kids perform tasks. There's nothing like a prodigy kid, right? And these are like prodigy kids, like they're coming off the reserve. They don't like their culture, right? They want to assimilate their culture as a threat. So to some people, this must have been incredibly impressive watching these kids get their hair cut and get thrown into smocks and just, get taught how to act more like them. It's fucking gross, dude. I agree. So did people take down Sir John A. Macdonald's statue this year or last year? They did. A lot of people are pissed off about it, and a lot of people were like, it had to come down. What do you think? Well, I'm not very much into vandalism, but it had to come down. It was kind of like putting Hitler's statue up and just like, it's okay. It's not okay. No, it's not. He advised Canada to support church-run industrial or manual labor schools where Aboriginal children would live. As a result, the Canadian government embraced the residential school system with its financial support. 4 churches began to formally open schools in 1892. They were staffed by members of the Methodist United Church, Roman Catholic Church, Presbyterian Church, and the Church of England, Anglican Church. The churches were eager to receive annual funding to run their schools and teach their religions. The downside was that the funding for each student, known as per capita grant, was never enough. By 1938, the per capita grant for residential schools was only $180. It was too low to provide proper nourishment, clothing, education, and health care for children. Wow, this is starting to sound like Gandhi a little bit, isn't it? Yeah, very much. What did Gandhi say? Poverty is the worst form of violence. Yeah. That sounds like a little bit of foreshadowing there, Llama. Former students confirmed the reality. Food was scarce and their everyday clothing was patched and mismatched. The good school clothes were locked away for special occasions, recalls survivor Pauline Belrose Cree of St. Bernard Mission Residential School in northern Alberta in the 1940s. The children only got to wear them when the school was showing off or covering up for dignitaries. Can you imagine? So you get dressed up and you pretend everything's okay when it's not. Well, that's how child abuse works, isn't it? Kids are scared. They can't run. If they do, they've got nowhere to go, and so they learn how to act. Schools were often located in isolated areas far from children's families, and the observation by outsiders such as newspaper reporters, teachers were poorly trained and paid. In 1909, Miss M. Dryhard of Winnipeg, Manitoba, taught at All Saints Indian Residential School in Lac-La-Ronge, Saskatchewan. The Anglican school teacher was paid a salary of $8 a month. Are you fucking kidding me? That's shit. Well, yeah, and you got no funding. Then you got desperation, don't you? What's that? Assumption. Bienvenue. Welcome. Indian Residential School, Bush Road. 70 miles at your own risk. What, like the kids were like dangerous? They were Indians. That's fucking stupid. Yeah, it is. But that's stigma. Can I go on the other side? Yeah, because I need to hold the phone this way. So this is not good enough. No shit. They're good enough, but they're just telling them they're not good enough. Buildings were built quickly with inadequate heating and water facilities. In 1908, 2 years after St. Margaret's Indian Residential School opened in Fort Frances, Ontario, Reverend Father G. Poitras petitioned the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs to provide an adequate water system for the school. Father Poitras wrote, "During the whole winter, water had to be drawn with horses and carried up the stairs in pails to flush the toilets. Indian Affairs and local Indian agents had complete control over the schools." Closing his letter, Father Poitras added, Pardon me for taking so much of your valuable time, but I have this great work at heart, and it should be so with you. As Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, you are the foster father of the poor Indians, and it is up to you that they look for help to improve their condition. Conditions did not improve. Sewage backup, broken down furnaces, moldy walls, and other facility-related problems continued at the school in the 1950s. The power of the Indian agent. One of the culprits at this time were Indian agents. They were self-serving, profiting from their power. They were really 2 laws at the time. The European law was new. A lot of the chiefs didn't know what it meant. The chiefs had their own law, but they put their X on a document in the spirit of cooperation, but they didn't know what they were signing. In our community, the Indian agent took away land and sold it to make profit for himself. We are still fighting to get our land back today. Richard Dick Bird of Ojibwe, Cochiching, First Nation student at St. Margaret's Indian Residential School from 1940 to 1948. And that's the road sign at Assumption. Indian Residential School is Hay Lakes, Alberta. The school was 112 kilometers, 70 miles down a gravel road. The Catholic school opened in 1958. It's fucking terrifying. Let's keep going. Feel like keeping going? I do. Inquiring minds want to know. Here's a good picture. It's a before and after. Is this like a makeover? Yeah, it's the Indian makeover. Prime Minister's vow. In Parliament, Prime Minister MacDonald adopted the motto of Captain Richard Henry Pratt of Carlisle Industrial School in the United States. The schools, as Pratt liked to say of his students, would kill the Indian in him and save the child. Are you fucking kidding me? That looks so badass what he was before. Now he just looks like a fucking, just like whatever. Like you see that every day. But that's just like, that's different. Well, they didn't want them to be different. They wanted to assimilate. That was the whole point of assimilation. Remember the Borg in Star Trek? This is worse. Yeah, because that was fictional. This was real. MacDonald vowed that Canada's goal was to do away with the tribal system and assimilate Indian people in all respects with the inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. The policy forced assimilation or aggressive civilization continued for many decades. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, said forcefully, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem." That's his problem. Yep, but he made it everyone else's problem too. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. So you're telling me they basically didn't want any Indians around, no matter what? Yeah. It would take 49 years before the residential school system and its policy forced assimilation ended. Several more decades passed before all Aboriginal children began attending regular schools. So we're like, they considered treasonous or something? Well, they were considered the enemy. They weren't just in the way. They were considered the enemy because they could fight back. So, they had to go through a severe breaking process to make sure that they would never want to be Indian again, or cop to even being Indian, right? They just, like he said, he would kill the Indian in him and save the child. It's messed up. That guy needs a spanking. Well, Sir John A. MacDonald has been dead for a long time, and they just removed his statue, so. Facts and figures. At one time or another, 144 residential schools existed in Canada. An estimated total of 150,000 children attended the schools. Imagine 5 hockey arenas, each seating 30,000 children. The schools had many names: Institute, Industrial School, Manual Labor School, Boarding School, Indian Boarding School, Residential School, Indian Residential School, Mission School, Federal Hostel, Billet, College, Girls' Home, Boys' Home, Hall, Boys' School, Girls' School, Orphanage, and Tent Hostel. Several non-denominational schools, 2 Mennonite schools and 1 Baptist school also existed. So before and after. The Canadian government staged dramatic before and after photos of the Aboriginal children. In the before photo, Thomas Moore, so this is Thomas Moore right here, a student in Regina Indian Industrial School, is dressed as a savage holding a revolver. That just looks fucking badass. He can get his own food. How old is he, like 8? Yeah, that's pretty cool, He looks like he's happy like that. Yeah. Happy-ish. Savage holding a revolver. In this after photo, he is civilized. He looks fucking pissed off. He looks like someone chopped his balls off, not just his hair. Well, probably felt like that to a certain degree. If they didn't do it literally, they definitely did it spiritually and psychologically. So he is civilized in his suit, Propaganda like this was used by the Department of Indian Affairs to justify the residential school system. Few knew that both the before and after photos were faked images with no connection to the Cree boys' real life. Thomas More's before clothing includes women's traditional attire, which a male would never wear. Are you fucking kidding me? Why would they do that? Maybe because they actually couldn't get someone to stand for a photo. Why is that? Because the Aboriginals don't model? There used to be something about not taking pictures. I can't remember what that was. Something about your soul? Something about your soul. Is that why you don't take pictures? No, it's because I'm vain and I hate the way I look. Oh yeah, that's real moral. That's the way it is. Looking at school. What did a residential school look like? Residential schools included many buildings. Schools covered large areas of land. St. Margaret's Indian Residential School in Fort Frances, Ontario, was a typical school. Richard Dick Bird, Ojibwe, attended. So these are girls' pickup baseball team at St. Margaret's in the spring of 1947. St. Margaret's, a Catholic school that opened in 1906. Dick was 8 when he arrived in 1940. He left at the age of 16. That's a long time to be there. Yep. Although the school was across the road from his home, he wasn't allowed to go home or to speak to his family through the fence. In 1962, replacement school opened. It was called Fort Frances Indian Residential School, and it closed in 1974. Do you think it got burned down? I think some of them probably wanted to bomb their school. You know, they would probably be happy to see it burn, but you know what? Sometimes people would be trapped inside, including students, so it wasn't that much fun. St. Margaret's Indian Residential School, 1944, Dick Bird, far right, with the school's hockey team, Rainy Lake Redskins. The old St. Margaret's School in 1906 to 1962. Staff quarters, barn, workshop, laundry. Main building, senior students classroom, girls dormitory, chapel, outdoor chapel, nuns quarters, boys dormitory, junior classroom, boys playroom, teachers quarters. Also at the school, the boys playground, girls playground, priest house, extra priest quarters, blacksmith shop, granary, boys and girls toilets, garage. Survivor speaks. In my years at St. Margaret's, girls and boys did most of the physical work. The girls did the laundry, cooked and cleaned, ironed, and took care of the younger children. They wove fabric and sewed clothes for students. I worked in the barn with cows and pigs. I learned how to plant and harvest the huge fields where we grew foods for animals and children, such as oats and barley. I could make soap. I cut all the students' hair when I was 16 in my last year of school. Sorry, let me get the picture. When I left the school, no one would hire me on the Canadian side of the Rainy Lake. I went to the United States side and found work. People over there were more open to working with Indians, unless Dick Bird, Ojibwe. Dick Bird is a member of the Couchiching First Nation, a community leader in Fort Frances, Ontario. And this is the new Fort Frances School in 1962 to 1974. It opened in 1962. Fort Frances Indian Residential School replaced St. Margaret's. Half the day system was abolished. Instead of working for half the day and being in the classroom for the other half, children were now in the classroom all day. This is the aerial view. Shows the school complex. So from far left to right, we have the cemetery. Apparently those cemeteries would fill up. Yes, they would. And that's what we're getting to. This is a genocidal system. It doesn't look like it. It seems like it's going to be nice, but it's not, isn't it? It's not nice at all. So 2 is the church. 3 is the barn. 4 is the priest house. 5 is the old main building site. 6 is classrooms. 7 is gymnasiums. And 8 is boiler room, staff residence. 10 is the chapel, and 11 is the student's dorm. Are you willing to give means to instinct our children as long as the sun shines and the water runs, so that children will long grow up in ever-increasing knowledge? Kinushayu, chief of the Cree at Lesser Slave Lake, Alberta, speaking the Treaty No. 8 Commission before the June 21st, 1889 signing of the treaty. And I think we'll stop there.